Welcome to the first video in my series that will be about nutrition, nutrition and metabolism. So what I'm going to do in this series of videos, I'll just go through a brief outline here, is I'm going to start with just a few videos talking about some general chemistry concepts, so gen chem concepts that will be useful for understanding ideas in nutrition and metabolism. And after that, then we will get into some of the macromolecules and the chemical properties of those macromolecules, which in nutrition terms you could maybe think of as macronutrients, which are the things like carbs, lipids, which contains fats, protein, and nucleic acids. And like I said, I'll go through some chemical properties of these, some biochemical properties. For instance, with things like protein, I'll go through some ideas of structure, which is not that important for protein as a source of nutrients, but as we get further along, the ideas that I talk about here in the protein structure will be important, and nucleic acids, which are things like DNA and RNA. So we don't get much nutritional value from these things, but the ideas that we discuss in the nucleic acids with the DNA and RNA will also be important, because a lot of nutrition and metabolism has to do with cell signaling, which affects gene expression. And so understanding DNA and RNA will be important for understanding gene expression. From the macromolecules, we'll move on. I'll talk about micronutrients, which are things like vitamins and minerals. So I'll discuss at first just some of the chemical properties of these, sort of in isolation, not yet in the context of metabolism and nutrition. But from here, sort of the pedagogical approach that I'm going to take is I'm going to follow these characters. I guess these are the main characters in our cast here, the macromolecules and the micronutrients. I'm going to follow those actually as we go through the body. And so, for instance, I'll start by talking about what happens when we put these things in the mouth. And there's a lot of biochemistry going on there. So, things like the salivary amylase, which is a type of which is a protein that catalyzes the breakdown of large sugar chains, things like starch and so forth. So I can talk about that. And then there are things like the taste receptors, and so I can talk about ideas that have to do with receptors and how receptors how the molecules from your food act as substrates for these receptors, and then that can lead to things like signal transduction. And so, just from talking about the mouth here, we are going to enzyme kinetics. We're going into receptor kinetics and signal transduction and things like that, just in the mouth. And then I can discuss things like swallowing, which then we have a different kind of signal transduction because we have things like muscle contraction. And so I can go into the physiology of muscle contraction. And from there we can get down into the stomach, which once again down there we have things like the trypsin and chymotrypsin, which are type of enzymes. So we can talk about the mechanisms and kinetics of these enzymes, and so from there we can go to the small intestine and all the various associated organs there, things like the liver, the pancreas, and with those things, with the pancreas, we can then talk about things like insulin, and so we can get into insulin, which then that can bring us all the way into various types of endocrinology, so the endocrine system. And so just following this sort of pattern, just sort of following this cast of characters through the body, we can hit a lot of different things in biochemistry and physiology. Of course, then there's the large intestine, all these things split off into different physiological and biochemical pathways. And so, like I said, that's the pedagogical approach that I will be taking. Is first I'll talk a little bit about the general chemistry that will be useful to know. Then I'll introduce us to our cast of characters here, and then I will take our characters through the body in a way similar to this. Obviously, I'll talk about more than just the things I've written here. This is just a very brief outline, and so that's the approach that I will be taking in this series of videos. So in this introduction, I just want to talk briefly about nutrition and sort of what nutrition actually is. So most people are probably aware of these nutrition facts labels. They put things on here like the fat and the cholesterol, sodium, carbs, protein, all that kind of stuff. So this is the FDA updated version of the nutrition facts. You can see this is actually from the FDA website. So these are all the different things that they've changed on it. So you'll see nutrition facts labels that look like this on your food packaging. And so what I want to point out here is, well, first I'll go over here. So these the fat, the carbohydrate, and the protein are based on this idea called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And so you see here that this is based on where our calorie sources should come from. And so this is saying, and you might disagree with this, this is just what the government has has decreed, I guess you could say, that we should get 45 to 65% of our calories from carbohydrates, 20 to 35% from fats, and 10 to 35% from proteins. If you are into things like the ketogenic diet and things like that, you will probably have different distributions that will downplay carbs, for instance, and increase the amount of calories you get from fat. But this is just sort of the AMDR that the government has decreed. And this is also based on the idea that fats, we get 9 calories per gram, and then carbs and protein, we get 4 calories per gram. I guess I should define here what a calorie is. A calorie, we'll call that small c, is equal to 4.184 joules, which is the amount of energy that you need to increase 1 gram of H2O by 1 degree Celsius. So this amount of energy will increase 1 gram of H2O by 1 degree Celsius. This is a really small amount of energy. So the calories that we talk about from our food, which should actually be large C calories. So this should be a large C, because what we are talking about in our food are actually kilojoules, or kilocalories rather. So kilocalories, which is equal to 1,000 of these calories up here. And so a big C calorie from our food is actually equal to 1 kilocalorie. So the calories we get from our food is larger than this here. It's actually 1 kilocalorie, so it would be 4,184 joules. And so this is the calorie from our food here. And a joule is just a unit of energy. So you've maybe heard with your electric bill, they talk about things like kilowatt hours. So a watt is just a joule per second. And so when you talk about kilowatt hours, it's kilojoules per second times hours, which is essentially, well, I mean, not essentially, it is 1 kilojoule per second times 3,600 seconds, which is the number of seconds in an hour. And so these units just cancel out, you multiply. So a kilowatt hour is just equal to 3,600 kilojoules. And so if you have more of an intuitive understanding of kilowatt hours as a measure of energy, it's the way the units are set up is that it is just the same as the kilojoules, but it's just multiplied by the seconds in an hour. So it's the same sort of unit of energy going on here, and so that's how a calorie is defined in nutrition, is that it is 1 kilocalorie, where a calorie is 4.184 joules, defined as the amount of energy that it takes to increase 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe this is when you are at 25 degrees Celsius, because this will change depending on what temperature you are at. And so this is the idea of the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or AMDR, and that's what these percents here are based off of. And so over here I have the daily calorie needs based on age, gender, and activity level. And once again, this is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so this is sort of the government decree about what the different activity levels, different genders, and different ages need as calorie intake. Once again, if you're somebody who's into different kinds of diets and stuff, you can have different opinions on what these daily calorie intake levels ought to be, but this is just what the government has said, and so I'm kind of wavering on this and not saying that these are definite values. That's sort of a takeaway that I actually want that's something I want you to take away from this video, is that there isn't really some set in stone accepted amount of calories or amount of different micronutrients like vitamin D and calcium and things like that. There isn't sort of a set in stone, well defined amount that we should take from this, and that is because of this idea of what's called the dietary reference intake. So the DRI, which has multiple things that fall under it, but this is sort of the idea that scientists and government agencies are talking about. So this is the dietary reference intake, and so under the dietary reference intake there are different ideas, and so we have on here, so this is a bell-shaped curve. This is a Gaussian distribution of the amount of some nutrient that is needed by the population. And so the idea is we have here the EAR, which is the estimated average requirement. And so the average here is at 50%, where if the population is getting a certain amount of nutrients, so we have a certain amount of nutrient, just maybe in grams, or actually grams is usually small g, so in grams. So if a population is getting a certain amount of nutrient in grams, then this is saying that at this amount of the nutrient, 50% of the population will be getting enough of that nutrient, and 50% will not be getting enough. And so that's what the estimated average requirement is the level at which 50% is getting enough of the nutrient and 50% is not getting enough. And so then from there we increase by 2 standard deviations here, and that's what gives us our RDA, which is the recommended dietary allowance. This is what is supposed to be how much you're supposed to be getting of a particular nutrient. And 2 standard deviations is the level at which 97.5% of the population, so 97.5%, would be getting enough of the nutrient. 2.5% would be deficient in the nutrient. But that's sort of considered to be good enough for the population. So given a certain amount of some nutrient at which 50% of the population is getting enough, 50% is not getting enough, then you increase by 2 standard deviations, and that's where you get your recommended dietary allowance, your RDA. And so we have over here this idea of the risk of deficiency over here and the risk of disease from excessive intake. And so our estimated average requirement is right here, where 50% of people would be at risk of deficiency. So this down here is the number of people at risk of deficiency. And then we move up to our recommended dietary allowance, and that's where 2.5.025 here, so 2.5% are at risk of deficiency, which, like I said, is considered good enough. And that is our recommended dietary allowance. And then we're somewhere in here, so sometimes you see these charts, and this will actually be shown as a range in here for our adequate intake. So the adequate intake, like I said, it's oftentimes shown as a range, and that's because there isn't really any good, well-defined amount that you should be taking. So they just define a range and say it should be somewhere in there. Then up here we have the tolerable dietary goal, sometimes called the tolerable upper intake level, and that is how much of a nutrient, usually talking about micronutrients, but how much of a nutrient that the population can be taking before you start seeing adverse effects from excessive intake. And so these are all parameters that scientists and governmental departments are attempting to define for all of the various nutrients. And so I'm not going to go too much into these, but these are just sort of flow charts that I found that sort of go through the various processes that these DRIs, these dietary reference intakes, go through in order for these nutrition facts to be established. So we see here we just have a bunch of different panels and committees who are constantly talking to each other about these different things, and what they are attempting to establish are what are called endpoints, and endpoints are basically criteria that they use for establishing these things, these EARs and these RDAs and adequate intake levels and things like that. And so they want these endpoints, and endpoints are often things like, well, most of the time they are disease endpoints. And so what they're trying to do is figure out how much of something, of a nutrient that you need in order to prevent a certain disease. And so down here I just have this table of the dietary reference intakes from the recommended dietary allowances and adequate intakes. So like I said, the RDA here is usually based on more well-defined endpoints, where adequate intake is sort of what they use. So adequate intake is sort of what's used if there isn't a very well-defined endpoint. This table doesn't discern between what is an RDA and what is an adequate intake. But you can see here, once again, that for the various vitamins, vitamin A, C, D, E, so on, they have for infants and children, and then males and females at different ages, and pregnancy and lactation amounts. And so you can see that they have all these different amounts. So up here they have the units, micrograms per day or milligrams per day for these different nutrients. And so these are based on these disease endpoints. And so over here I have a table from a different paper. So these are from different sources. And I have sources for these things listed in the description down below. So I have links to the various papers and websites that you can go a lot more into detail on these different things. But over here, this is just based on these DRI reviews. And so, like I said, these DRIs are not things that are set in stone. There's not some amount that they're like, we definitely need X amount of some particular vitamin, and that's just sort of the gospel truth. These things are always in flux. There's always improvements going on, and so this is just a table looking at 4 different things: sodium, omega fatty acids, vitamin E, and magnesium at these different review dates. And so you can see here that they listed the limitations of previous DRIs, things like lacked evidence for indicator of adequacy evaluated at multiple levels of intake, and so there's the new available evidence. So new studies come in showing that there might be differences in what they believe the DRIs ought to be, and so you might even be able to, with new evidence, convert an adequate intake into an RDA, which is sort of a higher standard. And so you can have different criteria. So, like I said, the endpoint is often disease prevention. So disease prevention. So it's the amount of some nutrient you need to prevent some disease. For instance, something like vitamin D. Like vitamin D is based on how much you need to maintain bone health, so maintain bone density. And I think in recent times, so this is vitamin D, in recent times this has been sort of up for review because vitamin D is involved in a lot more things than bone density. It's also involved in gene expression. And so there are other things that vitamin D are required for, and so I think in right now in 2020, as I make this video, vitamin D, the amount that you need of this is sort of up for review as far as how much you need, what your RDA is. So this is based on disease prevention. No. So another way you can measure this is through biomarkers, And an instance of this is vitamin C, which is based on it's based on how much is the maximum concentration in neutrophils, which are a type of white blood cell. So it's the maximum concentration of vitamin C, or ascorbate. It's the maximum amount of ascorbate in neutrophils. So concentration in chemistry, concentration is often denoted by putting square brackets around what you're talking about the concentration of. So the maximum concentration of ascorbate with little urinary excretion. And so what they actually do is they can take a blood sample, so they grab a blood sample and then they look at the concentration of ascorbate in your neutrophils. And there's an amount of ascorbate where so if we have concentration down here, or actually it would be, it's the concentration down here, and levels in your neutrophils up here. So as you increase your concentration, so this would be concentration of intake, and this would be your concentration in your neutrophils. So you could graph it like this. You might have, as you're increasing your intake, you're going up here, and then it will level off, and there's sort of a maximum here, where if you're in this area right here, if you're increasing your intake, you will also see an increase in excretion. And so you will be excreting out the extra intake, and so you're not increasing your concentration in the neutrophils. And so the maximum would be in this range here. And so it might be right there. They would say, well, this is the amount of intake you need in order to maximize the concentration in neutrophils without all this excess excretion here. And so you can come up with these biomarkers to test the amount of something like vitamin C, for instance, that you need for your RDA or your adequate intake. I'm not going to go through every vitamin. That will be covered as we sort of go through this video series. What I wanted to sort of get across here is we do have these nutrition facts that are, like I said, quite often sort of decreed by the government. I keep saying decreed, but as I've talked about here, it's this ever ongoing process where at least, ostensibly they're trying to find what the best amount is for the macronutrients and for the micronutrients, and so there's this ever ongoing process between the science and all these different government committees and subcommittees and so forth that are trying to come up with these different EARs and RDAs and AIs and things like that. So I just, like I said, my takeaway message here is that these nutrition facts, it says up here nutrition facts in these nice big bold letters here, like this is some set in stone idea, but these things are it's a process. It's an ongoing process. New science is constantly being done. Things are, uh, uh, no matter how slowly this process, they're still trying to update these things, and uh, new science comes in, things become adjusted, uh, and yeah. I'm just, like I said, the takeaway message is that nothing here is set in stone. This is all supposed to be based on the best science that we have. Uh, and so, yeah, like I said, in the next few videos, I'm going to get into some general chemistry that will be helpful for understanding nutrition and metabolism. Uh, Things like just how atoms work. I'm going to get into a little bit of bonding, uh, acid base, thermodynamics, things like that. Then we'll get into our cast of characters, and then we'll move on to the biochemistry and physiology and metabolism and things like that. And so I will see you in the next video.